Good evening, everyone. We'll just give it a couple of minutes to let everyone join, and then we'll get started. Happy to make a start, Stephen?
Yeah, definitely.
Great, okay. Good. Well, thanks everyone for joining this webinar. Today, Stephen Burr is going to talk about call changes. Please put any questions you have either in the Q&A. If you have any technical issues, put them in the chat, and I'll see those. Only my audio and video and Stephen's will be visible to anyone else, so feel free to eat your dinner or make yourselves at home while you're watching, and then hope you enjoy it. And please do put questions in the Q&A, and we'll discuss them at the end. So over to you, Stephen. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. A bit of a feeling of deja vu, 6 months on from April. Hang on, I'm trying to remember how to share my screen. Here it is. And we'll bring this up to go full screen. Okay, so hopefully, oh, security alert. I'm going to enable that. Right, hopefully everyone can see the screen now.
Yeah, it's coming through fine.
Good. So here we are, back with the webinar series. Last time I'd had Gareth's excellent first talk to warm everyone up. This time you're stuck with me right from the beginning, but at least we're getting me out of the way straight away this time, and then we've got a lot of exciting talks coming up over the next weeks and months, and hopefully we'll have a very successful series again. But today, call changes. So this is something that we've been thinking about doing for a while. A number of people have said they would quite like to see a talk on it, and so hopefully this is going to achieve the fulfillment of that request. So this slide was on my last talk. I'm going to make a few disclaimers. I'm not an expert. I've been ringing for quite a long time now, but I had a look at the list of people who have joined this evening, and there are definitely people in the attendees list who know a lot more about call changes than I do. So I hope that I don't make any big factual errors. Please point them out if I do. Yeah, what I say is not the be all and end all, and definitely happy to have people contributing to the discussion at the end with their tips and tricks and knowledge and so on, as well as questions. My slides aren't fancy. You know this from the previous talk. They're black writing on a white background. So apologies for not having any groovy animations or anything like that. There will most likely be typos and grammatical errors and possibly factual errors as well. Like I say, please point those out if I do make them. Again, I don't know if people will find this useful or whether it will just be stuff that you already know. And there is a good chance that you probably already know more about this than I do. So just before I dive into the talk itself, I just want to try and explain what I've tried to achieve with this. So I'm afraid it is going to be a lot of me reading what I've written on the slides. I know that's not really the most interesting way of doing a presentation, but what I want people to be able to do is to read through the slides again, if they wish, without having to listen to me talking the whole time. I kind of want the slides to sort of stand up on their own, so that people, if they are interested in reading over one bit again, they can go to that without having to load up the video and scroll through to the correct time point and so on. And yes, that's really what I want to try and achieve. I want to give some of the theory behind call changes in a way that people can go back to, and I really would encourage people who are learning to ring call changes to do homework, basically. So take some of the theory from the slideshow, the talk here, but then really apply it yourself. So rather than just listening to me, actually write out some changes and work out what you would do to swap the bells around. So that's sort of the plan. That's where we're aiming for, and hopefully we'll achieve that. So let's get started. This is a rough outline of what I'm going to cover. I'm hoping it won't take all that long. We'll just start off with a bit of background on what call changes actually are, and everybody will know that there are named call changes, and we'll just talk a little bit about them. Then I've just, to put call changes into context, talked a little bit about when they get rung, and then we'll go into the theory of how they work, basically, and hopefully cover what you need to do as a call change ringer to make sure that you're in the right place and that you know where to go when the calls are made. I've talked a little bit about striking, but that's a can of worms that I don't want to open too far, but we'll cover that when we get to it. Then I've talked about actually putting calls in yourself, which I think is something that everybody is perfectly capable of and should have a go at. And then I'll just finish off on Devon call changes. I don't know all that much about them, but I'm sure there are people who do. So I'm hoping that having that at the end will then allow more information on Devon call changes to come from the group, basically. So let's get started. So what are call changes? Well, they change the sequence of the bells by swapping the positions around, as simple as that. The clue's kind of in the name, and the other part of the clue is that the instructions for these swaps are called out by a conductor who's selected before the ringing occurs. And we usually have certain constraints applied to these swaps. So usually only one pair of bells swaps at each call. I've put usually because occasionally conductors will take a shortcut and put in several changes in one go. The most common time this occurs is right at the beginning or right at the end, where you want to get the bells back into rounds or get them started into call changes faster than usual. But normally it's just one swap at each call. The pair of bells that's swapped over must be next to each other in the change, so in adjacent positions. Normally, the tenor bell stays as the last bell in the change. Now, that usually happens just because most of the changes that people are interested in ringing have the tenor at the end. But there will be times when the conductor might decide to spice things up again. Phil Gorman has been known to do this on quite a regular basis, and the tenor can actually move into the change. So that's often, not always, that it stays at the back. The calls themselves are made at a hand stroke, and they take effect the following hand stroke. So you get a full pull of the rope, backstroke, and the next hand stroke to interpret what you've been told to do and then to put that into action. And because the calls are made one whole pull in advance, that means that each change has to last for at least that length of time. So the fastest you can change the bells is to put in a call at every hand stroke. all those calls would take effect the following hand stroke, and so each change would last for a whole pull, a backstroke and a hand stroke. But there's usually no rules on how long you can ring each change for. So you could have one change and then ring that sequence for as long as you wanted before moving on to the next one. And the overall aim of chord changes is normally to reach certain musical changes other than rounds. Now the term musical is one you'll come across in bell ringing a lot, and really it just means something that a particular person likes to hear, is somehow pleasing to their ear. And that brings us on nicely to talking about named changes. So for some reason to do with music theory that I don't know, intervals and that sort of thing, there are certain changes that just are particularly musical when you hear them. They sound very nice. They just kind of work as a change. And over the years, lots of these special changes have acquired names. I've written perhaps the three most famous ones: queens, kings, and titums. But there are many more. Some of these named changes will work on different numbers of bells. So you can have queens on 6, as we've written there, but you can also have it on any even number of bells. So anywhere up from 4 to 60, you could ring queens. But there are others that are specific to a certain number of bells. One example of that is weasels, so called because when you ring that sequence of changes on 5 bells, you get the tune Pop Goes the Weasel, which I'm not going to sing. And a list of name changes can be found at the link that I've put in there. It's probably not an exhaustive list, but there are quite a few there. The names, some of them are obvious, like weasels and titums, which has the sound titum, titum, titum. Others are less obvious. Excuse me. I've heard that queens was rung at the coronation of a queen. I'm not sure which one, perhaps Victoria. Kings, I've heard, was named because there was a queen's and there wasn't a king's. But perhaps what I'm hoping people might do is to put some comments in the chat or in the Q&A at the end to maybe enlighten us a little bit more about some of the more famously named changes and where those may have come from. I think it could be quite interesting to get some thoughts on that, whether or not they're completely true or apocryphal, doesn't really matter. So feel free to put your favorite name change in the chat and why it has that name. We'll cover those at the end. So when do we ring call changes? So here I've just written out one path that a new ringer may follow through their career. Obviously you don't have to go this route, but this is typically what people end up doing. So first thing you do is learn to handle a bell. Next you have to learn how to ring it accurately in rounds. Then most people will move on to rounds and call changes. So we'll start to introduce this idea of swapping the bells round. And then quite often people will move on from there to do things like tenor behind to a method, maybe start playing hunting, ring a method inside, maybe a plain method inside, plain barb or grancer or something like that. Then maybe if they get good at that, they'll start to treble bob hunt and then start to ring maybe treble dodging methods inside. And if they are still going strong, they might decide to start splicing methods and any number of other complicated things. And they will probably also start to do things like ringing a quarter peal, which then might progress onto ringing a peal. And then you find yourself ringing lots of peals, and in the end, maybe you ring too many peals. Although I'm not going to comment on what I think too many peals is. But really, what you tend to find is a lot of people view rounds and chord changes as sort of this stepping stone to get to the more interesting stuff, the complicated stuff. And rounds and chord changes is kind of left behind in this very early stage of your ringing career. So is this true? Are rounds and call changes just for learners? Is that how we should view them? So as I say, they're often seen as a stepping stone, although it has to be said it's an important one. We've all learned to ring call changes, and it's been very key to then being able to go on and ring methods. And this does fall at that stage between learning to handle a bell and going on to do the method ringing. But my opinion is that they're definitely not just for learners to ring. So they're particularly good for things such as weddings and funerals. You've got to remember that most people attending church services, especially weddings and funerals, they don't know much about bell ringing, and they don't really care if you're ringing spliced surprise major or if you're ringing rounds and call changes. And actually, in many ways, call changes are more suitable for these events because the bells just spend more time in nice musical changes. You can call the bells into something like Kings or Queens, and you can let that change carry on for a minute or two, whereas in a method you would only get that row once and then it's gone again, and you're back to something less recognizable. And of course, there's also less chance of firing out call changes, which again, it's more pleasing to the ear if there aren't big mistakes and having to go back to rounds and so on. Also, there are some striking competitions that have a call change category, so that can be a very good reason to ring call changes to be able to enter a band into that category. If you're out on an outing or ringing at an unusual church, which has heavy or challenging bells, then again, it can be much better to ring call changes, something that's well within the capability of the band, than trying to ring a method where you may be struggling to move the bells around properly. And actually, we'll touch on this in a bit more detail later, but well-struck call changes are quite difficult to achieve. And so even for experienced bands, they can be very useful as an aid to improving striking and generally just having some nice ringing. And finally, there are many towers, as we'll come on to at the very end, in the southwest of England, where they really only ring call changes. And some of those bands ring to an extremely high standard. And so call changes can be extremely nice to listen to, and there are people who ring them very well. So these are all reasons why we shouldn't just think of call changes as being for learners, and that once you're done with them, you've moved on to the more complicated stuff, and that's that. So hopefully I've convinced you that call changes are worth thinking about. And now we're going to get stuck into the theory behind call changes. I'm going to try not to get bogged down too much on these slides, and if you do feel like I've gone through them too quickly, then please do use the slides, which hopefully will be uploaded to the district website. Please do use them to go back and recap things. So what happens when a change is called? So as we've said already, we get a pair of adjacent bells swapping at each call. And so apologies to anyone who's colorblind, but I'm going to use this very simple change here for the next few slides. We're not going to look at lots of different changes. Hopefully we're just going to apply the theory to this very straightforward swap. So we start off in rounds and we swap the 2 and the 3 over. So this would be the first call change in lots of different call change performances. This would be a very common way to start. So what can we say about what happens when this swap occurs? Well, we have 3 bells that are affected by the call, i.e. they're doing something obviously different. And the thing they're doing that's different is they're having to follow a different bell to the one that they were following before. So we had 2 after 1, 3 after 2, 4 after 3. We've now got 3 after 1, the 2 is after the 3, and the 4 is after the 2. So in this case, these are the 3 bells that have been affected by the call. The other bells don't move their position, and they continue to follow the same bell as before. So they've been unaffected. Nothing has changed immediately for them. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So I'm going to introduce really the two main bits of terminology in terms of talking about the bells moving around in these changes. So I've got down to the front and up to the back. So the front of the change is the beginning here, where the treble is, the bell leading is at the very front, and the bell that's ringing behind is at the back. And we have this convention in ringing that if you're moving towards the front of the change, then you're going down, and if you're moving towards the back of the change, then you're going up. And as far as I'm aware, that's fairly universal. So let's try and describe what's happening in this swap in a bit more detail. So let's start with the 3. So the 3 in this case moves down one place, goes towards the front of the change, and in doing so, it's now following the treble, which is at this stage leading. The 2 moves up one place in the change, and now is following 3. So these are the 2 bells that have swapped. 3's moved down, 2's moved up, and they are consequentially following a different bell. The 4 doesn't change its position. It stays stationary in the same place, but the bell that it's following has changed. The 2 in front have swapped over, so now the 4 is following the 2. And as we've said on the last slide, the other bells are unaffected, so they're doing the same thing as they were doing before in the same position. So they haven't moved anywhere, and they're not following anybody different. So on paper, that's what happens. That's how we can explain this swap. But we also have to consider what that entails in terms of when you're in the tower, which hopefully some people are now back in the tower, ringing call changes and so on. So what does that entail in terms of handling your bell? What changes in that respect when the swap occurs? So same change again, exactly the same swap as we just described on paper. So let's go through it and work out what the bells actually have to do handling wise. So the bell that moves down, which is 3, it's now one position earlier in the change. It's ringing slightly sooner than it was last time round. So to achieve that, you need to pull the bell in or ring it slightly quicker at the hand stroke after the call. So when the call takes effect, the hand stroke later, that's when you make this adjustment to move the 3 one position earlier in the change, pulling it in, not letting it rise quite as far as you normally would to get it to ring slightly quicker. The bell moving up, which is number 2, that's now ringing one position later. So you do the opposite to what you do when you're moving down. You hold up slightly further up to towards the balance, possibly even onto the balance if you're ringing at a tower where the bells go a bit slower, or if you're ringing a very light bell, to move up into the position behind where you were. And again, this is taking effect, the hand stroke after the call. The stationary bell, the 4 in this case, it isn't moving position, as we've said, so you don't need to make any change in your bell handling. All you need to do is to look for the swap so that you can now follow the bell that's moved up instead of the one that you were following. Importantly, these adjustments need to be made in a single stroke. So this hand stroke after the call is made, you need to try and get the swap done cleanly, all in one go, so that you've moved those positions and you haven't kind of gone halfway and you're finishing off the change at backstroke. You also need to make sure that you don't go too far in the direction that you're heading and then have to adjust back at the backstroke following. And so all the bells should return to the nice steady speed that they were ringing before at the backstroke after the change occurs, so straight away. So in terms of bell handling, that's what we're trying to achieve. So the conductor, as we said, calls this swap the hand stroke before it takes effect. So you get a backstroke and a hand stroke to sort of determine what you're going to do. But we also need to know how this information is conveyed from the conductor to the rest of the ringers. So I'm going to give us three options, three ways in which the conductor could potentially instruct us how to do this change. There are other variations that you could have, but we're just going to consider three potential ways forward. So option one that we're going to look at is to give an instruction to all three of the bells, and one instruction to each bell that's being affected. So if we did that, then the conductor would shout something along the lines of 3 to treble, 2 to 3, 4 to 2. So that's three separate instructions, all given in a row. I've put minor variations as possible because the way in which the conductor will say these instructions, you can vary it slightly. So I would say that bell number X and then the word 2 and then bell number Y is probably the most common format, but some people may say 3 over treble or 3 after treble. Some people may even just say the pair of numbers and omit this 2, but those are just all minor variations. And so usually you will always be getting sets of pairs, so 3 to treble, 2 to 3, 4 to 2. So taking this approach gives the most comprehensive set of instructions that you could give. It tells everybody what they need to do. But we've already discussed how we've got one whole pull before this call takes effect. And actually saying those three calls all in a row takes relatively long time, especially if you want to say it clearly. So by the time you've delivered this last instruction, or the conductor's delivered it to you, you're getting quite close to the point where you actually need to make the change anyway. Also, this list of calls contains quite a lot of redundant information. So the way I was thinking about this when I was writing the slides is, imagine you had 4 people in a line, say John, Paul, George and Ringo. If you wanted Paul and George to swap over, you would say something along the lines of George stand in front of Paul. You wouldn't say George stand in front of Paul, Paul stand behind George and Ringo stand behind Paul. You just wouldn't require telling everybody what they need to do. The one piece of information would be enough, and then the others would work out what they need to do based on that one instruction. Unsurprisingly, the following two options we're going to look at will cut down this information to a single call, and we then need to work out how the other bells decipher what to do. However, before we leave this first option, I would just say that although this is not done very often this way, and some people might say that this is a bad way to do it, personally, I think that doing it like this when someone is at the very beginning of learning call changes, I think it can be helpful because it allows them to receive all of the information that they need to get used to actually making the swaps. So rather than having to worry about what they do in terms of bell handling at the same time as trying to work out, oh, I've got no idea who I follow, what do I do next? Instead of that situation, they get all of the information they need. They get told what to do at each change, regardless of which of these three bells they are, and they can concentrate on trying to make that change accurately. So in my opinion, using this option can sometimes be of benefit. But now we're going to move on to possibly one of the biggest questions you get when discussing call changes. What's this whole business between calling down and calling up? So my attempt to explain that is coming up. So let's look at option number 2, which is calling down. So what this means is that instead of getting all 3 calls, we only get the call that tells the bell moving down in the change what to do. So if you remember, we've got down to the front and up to the back. So the bell in the pair that's swapping, that is moving forward in the change, that's the one that we're going to give the instruction to, and we're going to leave out the other 2 instructions. So with this call, that instruction would be 3 to treble. So we're telling 3 that they need to move down the change and follow the treble. So that's where this calling down business comes from. So it does exactly what I've just said. It tells that bell that they need to move forward, down to the front, 1 position. But what about the other 2 bells? So the bell that's moving up knows that they've been shoved out of the way. 2 here is ringing along quite happily in rounds after the treble, and suddenly the conductor says 3 to treble, and so the ringer of the 2 thinks, well, I was following the treble, so this means something's going on. I've got to do something here. And what they do is they swap with the bell that's moving down. They're the one moving up in the change, and essentially this call has given them the information that they need. So they were following the treble. The 3 has been told to move into that position. So the resulting situation for them is that they now have to follow the 3. That's the only option they've got. They can't follow the treble anymore, and the 3 has moved into their place. The bell that stays stationary knows that they need to follow a new bell because the one that they were following has been moved. It's gone somewhere. It's gone down in the change, but they're not told which one they need to follow. And that's kind of the gap in calling changes down. That's the unknown quantity that you lose by not including the other 2 calls. And in a few slides time, we're going to discuss how you get around that problem. Right, so now let's move on to calling up, and many of you will have preempted what calling up is. It's to give only the call that tells the bell moving upwards in the change what to do. So in this case, we tell the 2 what they need to do, and the call would be 2 to 3. So we've covered this one. We're telling the bell moving up who to follow. In this case, the bell that's staying stationary, number 4, they get the information they need from this call because they were following the 3 in this case, but they now know that the 2 has been called to follow the 3. So that's what they need to know. They're not following this one anymore, they're following that one. And because the pair of bells that's swapping are the 2 that are involved in this call, they also know that they're the stationary bell, they're not moving anywhere. So they stay in the same position. In this case, it's the 3, the bell moving down in the change, that knows they've been affected because someone different has been called to follow them. They know they need to move down in the change, but they don't know which, they're not given the information to tell them which bell to follow. So there's the gap with calling up. It's the bell moving down who needs to work something extra out. So hopefully that's covered the difference between calling down and calling up. So we've always got the same 3 bits of information that we could give for each change. They stay the same, but what we do is we decide to include just either the down call if you're calling down, or in calling up you're only giving the up instruction. You're missing the other 2 instructions out. So calling down and calling up would be widely considered the standard ways of calling changes. So in almost every tower you went to, they would use normally either one or the other. The terminology can be a bit confusing. So we've talked just now about calling down and calling up, but you may also hear people saying things like call a particular bell down to the front. So call the 5 down to the front. Now, what this doesn't mean is that you use down calls to achieve this. You may use down calls, but you could also call a bell down to the front using up calls. Here, we're specifically talking about moving a bell within the change using call changes. So things can often get a bit confusing when you hear people using bell ringing jargon, and this applies to all stages of bell ringing, not just call changes. So if you're ever confused about what someone in the tower is saying, then do ask them to clarify it. If someone says call a bell down to the front and you're not sure exactly what that means, then get them to tell you rather than staying confused. So, as we've said, most towers will usually use one or other of these calling methods. And quite often you find that towers nearby to each other will use the same one. So if you learn at a particular tower and you learn your call changes in using one of these methods, you can probably be fairly confident that if you go to the tower down the road, they'll use the same approach. Quite often you have to travel a little bit of distance before you find a tower that uses the other option. Now, most ringers are convinced that the method they're used to is the correct one, and that the other one is not as good or even just plain wrong and shouldn't be used. Now, people can make quite compelling arguments for and against the two different methods. Some people would argue that calling up is better because X, Y, Z, and others would argue that calling down is better because A, B, C. In reality, both are equally valid ways of calling changes as long as the band knows how to interpret the call properly. So always a good idea if you're in an unusual tower, you're visiting a different area that you're not used to just ask before they start calling the changes which method they use, because then you can be prepared to do the right thing rather than get confused. But before we move on, we need to come back to this dilemma that we had using these two options. In both cases, one of the affected bells was left wondering who they needed to follow. So let's try and go through how you know what to do at a call. How do you approach this? Well, the key to knowing who to follow next is to pay attention to every change, even if you're not an affected bell, and work out, first of all, how and if it affects you immediately, and also what it does to the bells around you, because knowing what the bells around you, as well as the one immediately before you, are doing is the way that you learn how to fill in these gaps that are left. So let's have a look at 5 in this call that we've been looking at. So we've said that 5 is unaffected by this call. So it'd be very easy for the ringer of the 5th to work out that they weren't affected by the call and then just happily carry on ringing and not really think any more about it. But consider if the next call in a calling up tower was 4 to 5. So what if we swap 4 and 5 over here? Or what if we were in a tower where they call down and we swapped 2 and 4 over? Now, in both those cases, the 5 would be the bell that's left with that gap in knowledge. And if the 5 hasn't paid attention to what's going on further down the change and assumes that rounds is still applying, then they're going to do the wrong thing. They're either, in the case of the up call, they're going to try and move down and follow the 3 when they should be following the 2. Or in the case of the down call, this should swap over 2 and 4. It's the 5 might try and follow the 3 down here instead of the 2. So although it's been unaffected by this call, the effects of the call further down will impact the ringer of this bell at subsequent changes. So hopefully that illustrates why it's not just these 3 bells that need to pay attention to what's going on. It's actually everybody. So the general rule is, if you know at least the 2 bells that are in front of you at any given time, so the one that you're following and the one in front of them, then you will be able to work out what to do at the call, even if you are the bell that's left a little bit in the lurch, even if you're the bell that doesn't have all of the information they need. And this is true regardless of whether the calls are going in down or whether the calls are being put in up. So this is the sort of thing that you would need to do at each call. You need to listen to the call, work out if you're affected immediately by the change. If so, you need to make the necessary adjustment to your position and or follow your new bell. But then once the change has happened, you need to identify not only the bell that you're now following, if that one has changed, but you also need to try and work out the bell that they're following. And that's true even if you weren't affected. And then once you've established that in your head, you then need to obviously listen out for the next call, and the process starts over again. So the tricky bits of this, the things that you will find yourself wondering about while you're ringing call changes. First of all, working out whether you're affected. So are you a bell that needs to do something immediately? So here I've written out some rules that you can learn that will apply at every change. So I'm going to go through them quite quickly now, but please come back to this slide if you're interested in spending a bit more time and just read through each one, compare it back to the example up here or other examples that you want to write out, and cement that knowledge in your head, because it's useful to know. So if you hear the number of the bell that you are following when the call is made, then you're definitely affected. That applies to both up calls and down calls. So on the second, if you hear the treble at any point, then that means you're affected. If you're ringing the third and you hear the 2 involved in the call change, then that means you've got to do something, and so on. Now we've got slight difference between the 2 methods. So if you're ringing changes that are called up, if you hear your own bell number, then you're also definitely affected. So if the changes are going in via the calling up method, then hearing the bell that you're following or your own bell number indicates to you that you're definitely affected, and that rule applies all the time. When the changes are going in down, it's slightly different. So if the first number that's called out in the change is yours, then that means you're affected. But if your number is the second one, so in this case 3 to treble, the 3 is affected by that change, but the treble is actually unaffected. So that's slight difference between up and down changes there. And then finally, if you hear neither the number of your own bell nor the one that you are following, then you're definitely unaffected. So in the case of the 5 here, the 4 isn't mentioned at all, and the 5 isn't mentioned at all. So if you and the bell you're following are not called out, then you are unaffected. So like I say, we've breezed through those. There's quite a lot of words there. I would recommend that you come back to this if you want to, and just actually think through this with a pen and paper and kind of cement that down and work out exactly what I'm trying to say on this slide. So the next tricky part, we're going to concentrate on specifically on calling up. So we've established how you work out whether you're affected, but now what do you do? So for this call, we've got again the pair of numbers 2 to 3. what do you do? So the first number that's called out is the bell moving up. That's always the case when changes are being called up. This number is always the bell that's moving one place up in the change. And the second number is always the bell that's moving down one place in the change. So when the calls are going in called up, the two bells that are called out are the two that are swapping over, and it's always this order, up and down. So the bell that's moving up is the lucky one because it gets told who to follow. The bell that's moving down, this is the bell that has the gap. It knows that it's moving down in the change, but it doesn't get told who to follow. So this is where it's important for the 3 to know that the treble is leading, one bell in front of the bell that they're following. So if the 3 knows that they're following 2, who is following 1, then when this change goes in, they know that they move down and that they're now following the treble. The stationary bell, in this case 4, they don't have their number called out, but they've heard the number 3, the bell that they're following, so they know that they're affected by the change. And because the pair of bells called out here is the pair that are swapping, the 4 knows that they simply need to follow the bell that they weren't already following. So 4 knows they were following 3, 3 gets shoved down, 2 gets moved up, and the 4 knows that they can't be following the same bell as they were, so it has to be the other one that was called out. Again, that's probably made no sense with me saying it quite quickly, but go back, have a look at it and work it out for yourself. And now let's go over the situation with calling down. So now we've got the call 3 to treble. As we've said, the first number called out in down calls is the bell that's moving down. So this is affected. The 3 moves from behind the 2 to behind the treble. But we now have this situation where the treble, the second bell involved in the call, is not actually affected by it. It's kind of a bystander. Whoever was following the treble before the call went in, so in this case 2, they know that something's happened because another bell has been called to follow their bell. So if you're ringing the second after the treble and you hear the call 3 to treble, you think, okay, I can't be following the treble anymore because the 3 has been told to, so I have to follow the 3. That's the bell moving, the second is the bell moving up in the change. So they get the information they need. The stationary bell, in this case, is the bell that's left with a lack of information. So they've heard the number of the bell that they're following, 3. So as we discussed 2 slides ago, they know that something's happening. They've heard the number of the bell that they're following, and that means that they're definitely affected in some way. But what they don't know is which bell is moving up in the change, because that isn't given to them. So they know that they need to stay ringing steadily. They're not moving their position in the change, but they need to know that the bell in front of the 3 before the call went in was the 2, and that's the bell that they follow. So again, this is where you need to have that knowledge of the bell you're following and the bell in front. So final tricky part, I think, before we move on to the next bit, is how do you do this? How do you work out the 2 bells that are in front of you? Well, hopefully we'll always know the bell that we're following. We get used to that when ringing rounds, and hopefully we don't too often end up in a situation where we've got no idea who is in front of us. But how do we go about doing this business of working out who they are following? Because that's a little bit, that's kind of a step further, one more degree of separation. So what you could do is, starting from rounds at the beginning of the call changes, you could try and keep track of the order of the bells after each change. So in your head, you could try and remember the sequence that's going on at the moment. But that's actually quite difficult to do, especially on higher numbers, to actually have that sequence of the bell order in your head at all times. So what most ringers will actually do is use what we call rope sight to work out which bells are in front of them and the order in which those bells are ringing. And what rope sight means is essentially watching the order in which the ropes rise and fall as the ringing goes on. And by seeing the order in which the sallies are going up and down, you can then work out the bell in front of you and the bell in front of them. Now, rope sight is a can of worms that we're not going to open today. It's a very important skill that is very difficult to teach, but I'm not going to attempt to do that in any way. It could be the subject of another talk, potentially. It's not something we're going to do tonight. But a couple of things you can do to try and work on this in the context of call changes is one thing you can do is to watch the call changes from outside the circle. So while not ringing, you can look at what's going on, and then you can try and see this order of the ropes without having to worry about handling a bell and moving it about in changes at the same time. And also, getting someone to call a predetermined sequence of changes that you've looked at in advance can be helpful. So if you know what's coming up, then you kind of know what order to look for, which may sound like cheating, but actually knowing what to look for means that you're then more likely to see it, essentially. So those are a couple of tips, but I'm not going to dig any deeper into rope sight than that. So that's a lot of the theory covered. I realize it went very quickly, and yes, I'm hoping that people will be able to go back to those at their own speed and decipher what I've tried to write down. Please feel free to email me or chat to me face to face, hopefully someday, if what I've said just made no sense at all and you can't make head nor tail of it. But moving on, because time is moving on. So I want to talk briefly about striking, just because I think it's important to mention whenever we're talking about ringing. We want the ringing to sound nice and not to be full of trips and clips and so on. So actually call changes are quite difficult to strike well because we're only swapping one pair of bells at each call, and for the rest of the time the bells are staying in the same position for blow after blow. This means that things like striking issues like odd struck bells and an inconsistent rhythm will be exacerbated because you're ringing that same change over and over again. And if there is a repeated problem, it's going to happen every time. Actually, in many ways, method ringing is easier to strike well because you have a constant movement and it's easier to keep rhythms going and things like that. Sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually true. Also, because the changes are only going in every so often rather than at each stroke like we do in a method, it's harder to get that swap accurate. In that single hand stroke blow, it's quite difficult to go from a steady rhythm to make a change and then to have it exactly correct back in the same rhythm. So it's very easy to clip, to move too far or to not move far enough at that one point at which you're supposed to get everything done. And also you often end up with calls that will give you small bells following large bells or vice versa. And this can cause striking problems because the rope sight is different when the size of the bells has this big discrepancy. I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but essentially it's because the size of the wheel on the bigger bell is so much bigger. There's more rope that needs to come down through the ceiling for the stroke to be completed. And so you have to leave bigger gaps or smaller gaps between them pulling their rope and you pulling yours than you'll be used to. So there's another reason why it can be difficult to get the striking correct. So how do we try and combat these potential problems? Well, rules number 1, 2, and 3 are to listen, not only to the calls but to the bells. Like I say, I don't want to go into striking in huge depth, but listening is key. If you find yourself on a bell that's odd struck, you need to try and work out what you need to do to get it to strike in the correct position. And the best time to do that is at the very beginning. And then obviously you need to maintain that adjustment to keep it in the right place. When the first couple of changes go in, you want to try and work out how much you need to hold up or pull in when you're making these swaps. And you need to try and kind of get in your head the amount of change that you need to make for those bells, and then do that same amount at each call. And if you're called in to lead, so if you are the bell that's asked to lead the change, you need to try and maintain the hand stroke gap to keep the rhythm going. That's important in ringing rounds, in ringing methods, and in ringing chord changes, unless you happen to be ringing Devon chord changes, which we'll just touch on at the very end. And as I've said, you need to be particularly careful when ringing over much lighter or heavier bells. Generally, heavy bells need to ring closer to lighter ones, so you need to pull off very close to when they're pulling their hand stroke or backstroke. And the other way round, if you're a light bell ringing over a heavy one, you need to leave a relatively bigger gap than you're used to. I'm going to skip this slide about striking competitions because I'm aware that we're running a bit long on time, and I'm going to spend the next couple of slides moving on to calling changes. So we can only ring call changes if there's someone to call them, and that someone could be you. So here's my advert for learning to call. I think it will improve your ringing if you give this a go. You'll improve your ability to see the order of the bells, because you'll need to be looking around to see where people are and how you want to swap them around. You'll hopefully get used to using your voice. If you're not someone who doesn't conduct things, you may not be used to saying much, but it's always good to hear new people calling. And hopefully you'll also get used to people doing what you tell them to. Which is what they should do when you're conducting. You'll get more confident on when the correct time to put calls in happens, and that's going to be useful if you then go on to call methods as well, because you'll have an idea for when are these calls supposed to go in. And you may be the person who makes the difference between just having some rounds and having some rounds and call changes, because you may well find yourself in a situation where you're the only person who can do this. And if you ring in a friendly and supportive tower, then there's absolutely no need to be anxious about having a go at calling changes. If you don't ring in a friendly and supportive tower, then I would ask why you're there, and maybe you should move to a tower that's friendly and supportive. But in conclusion, I think everybody should learn to call changes, or at least have a go. So where do we start with calling changes? So almost everyone will start by memorizing a short set of changes to call. So you'll learn exactly what you need to say in the order that you need to say it. And most commonly, I think people would learn how to call the bells from rounds into queens, which on 6 bells is this sequence: 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 6, all the odds and all the evens, and then back to rounds. So this is just 6 changes. I've written them out here. I've put a cross in to show the pair of bells that's swapping each time, and I've put in the call that would be required, either calling up or calling down. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, because you can all look at this yourselves in your own time and see exactly what's happening, how we're swapping the bells, the call that we're putting in. I don't need to go through that row by row. But what I would like to do here is to maybe give the first time call change conductor a way of thinking about what you're trying to do. So in this case, we're aiming for this change in the middle, queens. So we want to go from rounds to this different sequence. And when you're starting out, I think the easiest way to think about this is to build the new change from the front. So we're going to start at the beginning and say, we're in rounds with the treble at the beginning, and we want to get to queens. So first position, we can see that the treble is still in the same place. So we get the first bell in the change for free. Don't have to make any calls to get the treble into the right place because it's already there. So then we move on to this next bell in the change, the 3. So let's build the second bell in the change. We want to bring the 3 from wherever it is at the start to the position that we want it to end up in. So our aim to begin with is to get the beginning of the change to be 1, 3, and then some other bells behind. And regardless of which of these two calls we choose to use, we can see that the first change swaps 2 and 3, and that achieves this 1, 3. Then we look at the next bell in the change, 5. So we want to get from wherever we are now, 1, 3, some of the bells, to having 1, 3, 5, some of the bells. Now you can see that in this case, the 5 is not directly adjacent to where we want it to end up. So we actually have to put in 2 calls before we get to our 1, 3, 5 situation. But then very helpfully, we find that in this case, the rest of the change has built itself. So by putting in these first 3 changes, we've built the first 3 bells in the change of queens, which is what we're aiming for. And then as a bonus, we just end up with the rest of the bells nicely in the right position. And actually we've got to our target without even having to do any more calls. So this is a way in which you can logically put changes in to get from A to B. So build it up from the front. And what I've done on the way back is I've tried to do the reverse. So we're building rounds up from the front, starting in queens. What we were doing before was building queens from rounds. So I won't go through this again. You can see that as before, we get a couple of bonuses, which are bells that happen to fall into the right position, even without us needing to make calls. But the same idea applies. We're starting from the front of rounds, and we're sequentially bringing the next bell into the correct position with our calls. So I think that can be quite a helpful way to think about how you get from one change to another, is this idea of building up from front to back. Here's some words about starting out call changing. Let's have a quick look through. I'd say it's absolutely okay to memorize the changes that you're needing to call when you first start. It's generally not advisable to write them out and read them, because then that's not helping you to learn how to call changes. It's just reading from a sheet. But to have them in your head in advance is absolutely fine. The first time or the first few times you do this, you will be absolutely entirely focused on remembering the changes that you're trying to put in, and then trying to make those calls at the right point. You won't be thinking about, where have these people moved? What's the sequence at the moment? You will just be thinking, have I said the right thing at the right time? What's the next thing that I need to say? And this is also totally fine. You don't need to be an expert conductor the first time you try it. You're also going to make a mistake, because I make mistakes when I make call changes, and I've been doing it for quite a long time. So the first few times you do it, you are going to make mistakes. But don't worry about making mistakes. It's always acceptable to call rounds and start again if you need to. You can also always make it, or try and make it look like it wasn't your fault, because that's the conductor's privilege. But don't feel that if you make a mistake, then it's all a big failure and you have to just say stand and it's all a disaster. It's absolutely not the case. It's fine to start again. Hopefully with time, you'll become more confident with the calls. and you can start to look at those other aspects. So can you see how the call you put in is affecting the order of the change? If you say 2 to 3, if you swap 2 and 3 around, can you see that that's happened? Can you see who they're now following, as well as having put the change in? Can you start to hear if the striking sounds good or bad? Could you work out how to undo the last call that you've just put in case you make a mistake? Can you do that kind of on the fly? And once you start to be able to think about these sorts of things while you're putting the calls in, you can start to experiment a bit more. So in the examples we looked at before, you could do this change first. You could swap 4 and 5 over first, and then 2 and 3. So you're departing a bit from this kind of logically building things up from the front. You swap these 2 over, you still get to exactly the same point in the end. You've just done it in a slightly different way. You could even be more adventurous. You could call the 5 all the way down to the second position here, and then call the 3 in front of it. So at no point in this very simple progression does the 5 go below third's position, but there's no reason why you couldn't put it down into second's position on the way to queen's. Might make things more interesting. So once you started to do those sorts of experimentations, once you're feeling confident enough that you can start to manipulate things to your will rather than sticking to a very defined set of calls that you've learned in advance, then you can become a bit more inventive. Basically, you can do what you want with the calls. So what most conductors would do usually is to choose one or more of these nice named changes that they want to ring within a performance, and then they'll sort of work out how to get the bells from one change to another kind of on the fly. So as they go, they'll be thinking, okay, now I need to build this change, I need to move this bell from here to here, and they'll put in a sequence of changes that does that. And you find that there are some very classic sequences of named changes that you can incorporate into a session of call changes. This is one that I learned very early on when I was much younger, starting in rounds on 6 bells, calling the bells into queens, then into kings, then into back rounds, although the tenor stays at the back in this case. It's not complete back rounds, then titums, and then back to rounds. And this is something that you can do in about 5 minutes or so. You get to 1, 2, 3, 4 named changes as well as rounds, and then you get back to the beginning. Very nice sequence to call. But how do you do this sort of on the fly, making it up as you go along? Well, obviously, you always need to know what change you're in at the moment and where you ultimately want to get to. So you need to see where all the bells are, and you need to know where you want to move them to. The easiest way to do this is to use this sort of building technique that I've already described, so we don't have to go through this example. But here I've done it a little bit more complicated. We've gone from queens to titums, and so I've just outlined how you would build that change up from front to back. And as we've already said as well, the more experienced you become, the more variety you'll put in. So you won't have to do this completely logical, I need to work out where the treble goes, then I need to move the 4 to here, then I need to move the 2 to here, and so on. You'll start to be able to vary that. And this might allow you to reach some other musical changes en route from, say, queens to titums, and can also allow you to avoid ringing the same change twice, if you want to avoid having repetition. But the important thing to say is that the only way to learn how to do this is to have a go, to make mistakes and to learn from them. So you'll never get to the point where you can call changes as you go if you don't start by giving it a go. And now we are very nearly at the end. I realize that I've gone a little bit over the hour mark, so apologies from that. But here are just a few resources that you can use to help you start to hopefully do some of the things that we've talked about. So probably right at the top for people who are learning call changes is to watch and to listen, particularly when you're not ringing. So when you don't have that pressure of having to handle the bell, put it in the right place, make the handling adjustments to get the change correct, have a look and see what's going on. Listen to what the conductor's saying. Try and work out how that's changed the bells. Can you see the new order that the bells are in? That sort of thing. So you can work on calling changes without even having to ring call changes yourself. Secondly, homework. I'm a big fan of homework, and you'll be pleased to hear it's a COVID safe activity. So you can do homework now. Probably the only thing we can do really, apart from 15 minutes of service ringing on a Sunday. So these are the sorts of things that really are going to help you to master call changes, both ringing and conducting them. Write out 2 random changes, completely random, and then work out the calls that you would put in to get from one to the other. Or write out a list of named changes and work out how to connect them together with calls. And maybe start to plan your calls so that you avoid having the same change twice. Now, this isn't essential like it is in methods. You know, in methods, we're often wanting to definitely avoid repetition. Otherwise, we have a false touch or a false quarter peal, or God forbid, a false peal. In call changes, we're not so worried about that. But if you have more different changes, then it just adds more variety to the performance. So, you know, adding these extra little bits of flair can be good to do and good to think about even when you're not ringing the changes. But like I've said, again, most importantly, get stuck in, make mistakes, learn from them, and you will improve. I've got 2 links here for people who are interested in calling changes. This first one allows you to click you have rounds written out to begin with, and then you can click buttons that swap pairs of bells over, and it will swap the bells for you, as well as generating the change that you would need to call to make that swap happen. The one underneath is slightly different. That allows you to input a list of changes that you want to achieve, and it will then generate all of the calls that you need to get you between those 2 things. So essentially, these do the homework for you. So they're a little bit cheaty, but they're there if you want them. And this is the end. So we're going to talk very briefly about Devon call changes because I like them, and they're a very different style of ringing to what we mainly are used to here in the East. So mainly done in the Southwest, Devon and Cornwall. They ring their call changes with the bells below the balance, and they don't have a gap at handstroke lead. So you get a kind of rolling metronomic feel. You don't have that break every other stroke at the beginning of the change. The emphasis is placed on keeping this steady metronomic rhythm and having very precise striking. So getting those changes done really cleanly. Their performances usually follow set sequences of changes, and they call them peals. They don't last as long as a method peal would, but they use the same terminology. And it's not unusual in the Southwest to see these sequences of changes written out on the wall, on a board, or on a music stand in the middle of the tower. That does happen quite a lot. They also have striking competitions that occur between Devon call changes bands, and their competitions usually start with the bells down, and then the band will raise them in peal, ring the test piece that's been decided in advance, and then they'll lower them in peal at the end, and that whole performance is judged, not just the changes in the middle. And the standard of ringing in some Devon call changes bands is very high. You would hear call change ringing that would be as good as the best method ringers around there. So the very final thing I'm going to try and do is to give an example of Devon call changes. This video is 8 minutes long, but I'm not going to let it play for that long. I'm just going to play maybe the first couple of minutes to give you an idea of what Devon call changes sound like. Hopefully it works. Right, hopefully that gave you a taste of Devon call changes. Like I say, I'm sure there are people in the audience who know much more about it than I do. That's all I'm going to say for the presentation. It did go on for a little bit longer than an hour, which I apologise for. I also apologise that some bits were covered quite quickly, even though there were lots of words on the screen. I hope that people will be able to go back to those points and spend a bit more time without my waffling, working out what I was going on about. So I'm going to shut up unless you ask me questions. So if you don't want to hear my voice anymore, don't ask any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Stephen, for that. There's a comment from Sam in the chat recommending a book by Steve Coleman, which sounds good. He's written lots of good books.
Did anyone have any? Nobody had any named call changes with explanations? Nobody's got any questions. There are still 13 people in the 11 people in the attendees, so people stayed. But yeah, I guess I don't know. If there are no questions, then I guess we could bring things to a close. I think the plan would be to make the slideshow available on the district website, so that people can go back and look at them again. And I think Dave would plan to upload the video to YouTube, the YouTube channel as well, for anyone who either wants to watch again or didn't get to see it live. Otherwise, I think, yeah, we don't seem to have any questions and no more comments in the chat. So, yeah, I guess we'll say goodbye. Oh, thank you, Helen. we wanted to get the core changes talk done. In the end, I don't know, I found it quite hard to make it not dry, let's say. The blue lines talk was much easier to kind of get blue lines and things onto the slide to make it look a bit more interesting, but I found it a bit harder with the core changes, but hopefully acceptable.
Yeah,
right,
so.
well,
thanks very much, Stephen. That was good.
Yeah, I'll say goodbye then, and we will be in touch with further details about other talks in the coming weeks. Don't know if you want to say anything else, Jonathan?
No, nothing more from me, thanks.
Okay, good night then.
Good night.